Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. We've got a lot to get to this week as Barbie keeps breaking records and climbing up all these different charts, and Oppenheimer also continuing to make headway on other parallel separate charts, but also very interesting ones, as well as a breakdown of the rest of the top 10, a look at what's coming up this week. You know what we do here on the show. One quick programming note, we are on our usual Tuesday morning time slot here this week. Next week, we will be on Mondays. I will be using the dreaded estimates because of some travel that I've got coming up. So the show will be a day earlier next week on Monday morning, but still mostly the same information, just using estimates instead of the actuals, which, I don't like to do, but break class in case of emergency. Also, just a reminder about a couple of things down in the description below this video. You can find links to the Entertainment Community Fund, which is a nonprofit that helps to support people in the Hollywood/entertainment community, not just actors and writers, but makeup artists and special effects technicians and people that just are out of work right now. It seems like we maybe getting close to some kind of a breakthrough with the writer's strike. There at least has been a deal proposed, reportedly from the AMPTP to the Writers Guild. But even if this gets fixed in the next week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we still have the actors' strike going on. There are a lot of people in need, so you can find that link down there. Also down below, you can find the link to Cameo, which is something I've been doing for the past few months. It's been a lot of fun just reaching out to people. You can send in a request to ask a question or send a birthday greeting or anything like that. It's a new way to interact with people that I've really been enjoying, so you can find all that and some other stuff down below. But let's look at the box office for this past weekend. We'll start with the box office top 10, and the number one movie, as it has been the last 4 weeks, is Barbie, another $33.8 million. A drop of just 36% from last week. We have many Barbie charts to look at later on the show. It should be noted that Barbie has now passed the $500 million mark domestically. It's at just over $525 million. That ranks at 18th all-time on the domestic list. This week, it should pass Rogue One, Star Wars Story, The Dark Knight, and The Lion King, much more later. In second place, regaining its position, is Oppenheimer, a drop of just 35.4% from last week. These two movies keep dropping almost in lockstep. It's pretty insane how this keeps happening. $18.8 million, a total of $264.2 million overall. In third place is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. There was a big fight for what was going to be second and third place last weekend. Not quite as close this weekend. A $72.3 million domestic total, a drop off of 45.5% from its opening weekend, although keep in mind it did not open on a Friday, it opened on a Wednesday. In fourth place, not holding quite as well as the other movies in the top four, is Meg 2: The Trench with a 57.2% drop from last weekend, $12.8 million, and a running domestic total of $54.2 million. In fifth place, the only new wide release in theaters this past weekend after Gran Turismo delayed its release until next Friday. The Last Voyage of the Demeter didn't really make an impact at the box office, $6.5 million total in its opening weekend. In sixth place is Disney's Haunted Mansion. It drops 37.1% for a total of almost $5.8 million and a domestic total of just over $53 million. Not enough given its high budget point for this to be considered a success. Talk to Me, though, is one movie that could definitely be considered success, and another great hold in its third weekend, a 19% drop from last weekend, a total of $5.1 million, and a domestic total of $31.3 million, which based on its budget of around $5 million is a great return. Sound of Freedom charts at 8th place in its 6th week of release, a 35.7% drop and a $4.8 million total. Its domestic total now approaching $175 million. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 continues its disappointing domestic and honestly worldwide box office run. A 30% drop in its 5th week of release for a total of $4.6 million. Its domestic total now getting close to $160 million. And in 10th place is a film from India called Jailer, making about $2.5 million. This is a Tamil language film about a father out for revenge. It's from the director Nelson, who directed last year's movie Beast, also an Indian film, but not the one about lions trying to kill Idris Elba. Two movies dropping out of the top 10 this week. After 6 weeks, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny ends its top 10 run after a disappointing run given its massive budget. And after 2 weeks in the top 10, Rocky Aurani Ki Prem Kahani, it's probably the last time you'll have to hear me butcher that name, also exits the top 10. And looking at theaters lost over the past weekend, this would be the weekend of August 11th, Haunted Mansion leads the way. It lost 880 theaters. It's still in about 2,800 theaters nationwide. Elemental dropped 470 theaters. It is now out of what you would call wide release. It's now in 690 theaters. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny dropped 400 theaters. It is also out of what you would now call wide release. It's now in 790 theaters. Insidious the Red Door drops another 380 theaters. It's now in about 444 theaters. And then Dreamin' Wild, which was a limited release last weekend, drops 330 theaters. It only is in about 70 theaters. And this has been a trend with a lot of these limited releases, as Barbie and Oppenheimer have been adding screens over times, as theaters add showtimes, and as other movies keep coming out. These smaller limited releases just aren't able to fight for that space, and you'll see them losing screens after just 1 or 2 weeks. There's one limited release that we've talked about called Theater Camp that I think was really actually hurt by Barbie and Oppenheimer's success, because it's a really charming little movie. It's the kind of movie that needed that space, that needed those theaters to play out week over week, and the space just wasn't there, and it has now started contracting, and it's probably going to be a movie now, if it finds an audience, it's going to be on streaming. It didn't really get much of a shot theatrically. It's the downside of having two movies, really, in Barbie and Oppenheimer, that are doing so well simultaneously in the theatrical marketplace, along with other new releases that aren't doing too badly either. Now, as I always do, because I'm a glutton for creating more work for myself, I'm also adding a new feature to the show, and I'm going to try to keep up with it week to week as much as I can. We talk about movies that are dropping out of the top 10. We talk about movies that are losing theaters, but we don't really talk that much about movies that have closed, meaning movies where the studio has stopped reporting the grosses. And we actually had 4 movies that closed their domestic run this past weekend. So I'm going to try to keep track of it week to week, and let's look at the 4 movies that stopped reporting grosses this past weekend. The first one is the movie that kicked off summer 2023, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, after a domestic run of $358.9 million and an international run of $486.3 million. It closes its domestic run after 14 weeks and a worldwide gross of $845 million. It has no markets remaining, and looking at the estimated theatrical profit, I have the big worksheet that I do for all of the other releases that breaks down everything, but I estimate the theatrical profit for Guardians 3 to be at $28.1 million, given all of my usual variables, etc. Keeping in mind this is global ticket sales only, it excludes all ancillary markets. A lot of people might say $28.1 million for a movie that made $850 million? That doesn't seem like much. Keep in mind, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 had a $250 million budget reportedly, another $100 million in marketing. So that's $350 million all in before you make a dollar. And given the summer that Disney has been having, I'm sure that they're going to be very happy that Guardians Volume 3 was able to break even in the theatrical marketplace, because that means that all of the other revenue streams, their promotional partners, any kind of a digital streaming profits, when you rent the movie, when people buy the movie on physical media, that all gets added to that profit margin. That's what these studios really are fighting for. They want movies to break even theatrically, and then they can really start cashing in on things like merchandising and all of that. So it may not look like much, but this is actually pretty good news, especially for a movie with as high a budget point as Guardians Volume 3 had. Most of those movies this summer have not turned a profit in the theatrical window, and that means that studios have to work even harder to make those movies profitable in the long run. And maybe the biggest example of that this summer is The Flash, which ended its domestic release after 8 weeks. The Flash had a budget reportedly of around $225 million, another $100 million in marketing. So we're looking at about a $325 million investment for Warner Brothers. Its domestic gross is at $108 million. Internationally, it's at $160. That puts its worldwide gross at about $268.1 million with no remaining markets for it to be released in. And I'm estimating its theatrical loss at just over $200 million, which means it really doesn't matter how many Blu-rays or 4Ks The Flash sells or how well it does on streaming as far as rentals. I don't know what Warner Brothers Discovery is going to be able to make back, because it's going to sell The Flash substantially, or at least for its first lucrative window, to Max, its own streaming platform. But I think it's a very difficult proposition to see how this movie ever makes money for Warner Brothers Discovery. I think this is going to be a big money loser. I mean, $200 million loss in the theatrical window, that is incredibly hard to overcome one of the biggest bombs this summer, one of the biggest bombs in quite a long time, although there are a couple out there, namely really Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Once we get in those final numbers, I'm going to be interested to see how that stacks up against The Flash. Another movie with a much smaller budget, but that I am estimating a fairly steep theatrical loss on, is No Hard Feelings. It closed this past weekend after 7 weeks in domestic release, after a $50 million domestic gross and a $33 million international gross, bringing its worldwide gross to around $83.6 million. No markets remaining for this movie. And really the thing that kills No Hard Feelings is that it had a budget reportedly around $50 million. A big chunk of that was paid to get Jennifer Lawrence on board, about the same amount of money for marketing and promotion. So that would be around a $100 million investment in No Hard Feelings for Sony. It's not really making that money back. I estimate a theatrical loss at around $58.6 million. Now, the good news is that comedies like No Hard Feelings do tend to do well on streaming. And also, Sony, if you'll remember, does not have their own streaming service, which means they will be licensing this film out to other streaming services. So even though it has a $50+ million theatrical loss, I think that there's probably a good chance that No Hard Feelings does become profitable in the long run for Sony. However, with that smallish budget, I think their hope was that it would really catch on at the box office and become one of those money printers that we talk about. That's not exactly what happened, but I think its long-term prospects for profitability are good. Another movie that's got a little bit more work ahead of it is Transformers: Rise of the Beast. It had a decent theatrical run, especially domestically, but the problem was it was another one of those big budget movies. $195 million budget reportedly, with another $100 million or so pumped into marketing and promotion. That would be around a $295 million investment for this movie as well. When you look at its gross, it's at around $436.6 million worldwide. No remaining markets. After 9 weeks in domestic release, it ends its domestic run. It's already available on Paramount Plus. I estimate the theatrical loss for Transformers: Rise of the Beasts at around $111 million. That is difficult for Paramount, but not impossible for them in the long run to boost the profitability for this film. And really, I think what it helps with is merchandising. Merchandising is a big component of movies nowadays, and especially with Transformers. If you can kick off a new line of toys, Paramount actually has another movie that's in theaters right now, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. I was reading a report in Deadline that came out earlier today that the franchise, the property, is expected to generate $1 billion in merchandising sales, toy sales, etc. this year alone, driven largely by this new Mutant Mayhem movie. Over $100 million in the US alone just from this film. And that is really, for a movie like this, where you're going to drive profit. It's where Disney drives profit with Little Mermaid and with a lot of their Pixar films. It's where Paramount drives profit with Transformers and Ninja Turtles. Yes, it's nice when the movies do exceedingly well in the market and they make money in the theatrical window, and that's just a little bit of extra money. But it's the merchandising with movies like this that are the real lucrative thing, and it's why they keep making a lot of these movies, to be honest. Reportedly, it's why Pixar kept making Cars movies for so many years. Sure, the movies did okay theatrically, but they would drive hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in merchandise sales, which is why I'm always very careful to say on this show when we're talking about the profitability windows, etc., this is only box office gross. There are so many other markets that are out there that determine whether a movie is profitable or worth the investment for the studio or not. We cover the box office here on this show, but there are so many other windows out there. Let's take a look now at what I like to call the road to recovery, and we see that for the first time in a few weeks, the dotted black line, which represents the box office total for all movies this past weekend, dips below the average for 2015 through 2019, the years preceding the pandemic, although we are still well ahead of the average for the past couple of years as theaters were reopening. And you can see historically the highest grossing films for this weekend were Suicide Squad. This was Suicide Squad weekend. The highest performing film for 2015 through 2019 was the debut of Suicide Squad in 2016. And as low as the debut was, the highest performing film for the past couple years was the debut of James Gunn's The Suicide Squad, which had that split theatrical HBO Max debut. But Barbie, Oppenheimer, and the gang really keeping us above this sort of post-pandemic reopening of theaters, although we can't quite get to where we have been pre-pandemic. Looking at the summer box office chart as we get into mid-August, are these the 10 final movies of the summer? Well, Elemental, I think, is the one that would be in most danger of getting knocked off by something like Ninja Turtles if it continues to do well, or even something like Gran Turismo if it surprises people later this month. But right now, I think it's safe to say that Barbie is a lock at number one. It's at $526.4 million and climbing. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 stay in that second and third spot, and really the only adjustments were in that 6 through 9 region. Sound of Freedom moves up to the 6th spot for the summer, just edging out Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which is at number 7. And then Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 moves up to number 8. Transformers Rise of the Beasts moves down to number 9. And then you have Elemental in that vulnerable spot at number 10, although it's got a decent gross at $150.2 million. Looking at my predictions for the summer, again, The Little Mermaid will not be the number one movie of the summer. Right now, I picked numbers 2 and 3 correctly. I picked The Flash at number 4. That will not make the final list. It appears that I overestimated Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, although maybe not by that much. I had Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny in about the right spot. I overestimated Elemental. Of course, I picked Fast X. That will not be on the final top 10 list. And then I vastly underestimated the potential of both Oppenheimer and Barbie, but hey, at least I picked them both for the list and don't look too stupid. Let's take a look outside of the US and Canada domestic market and look at the top 5 films internationally. At number 1 is a Chinese film called No More Bets. It made $87.8 million over the past weekend. It's about people lured into an international fraud factory, forced to scam people out of their money online. Barbie's in second place with $45.1 million, followed by Meg 2: The Trench, which falls to third place at $43.7 million. Oppenheimer's in fourth place at $31.9 million, and Creation of the Gods 1: Kingdom of Storms is in fifth place at $23.9 million. When you take those international grosses, you combine them with our domestic weekend grosses, you get the top 5 films worldwide, and the number one movie is No More Bets at $87.87 million. Barbie's in second place. It brings in another $78.9 million worldwide, a 37.9% drop from last weekend. Meg 2: The Trench drops to number 3 at $56.5 million. It dropped 60.2% worldwide in its second weekend, so a little bit more of a drop worldwide than we saw domestically. Oppenheimer still holding strong, 38.1% drop from last weekend, but another $50.7 million gross, and it's still opening up in key markets. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem drops just 29.7% from its opening weekend last week, $25.6 million, and a lot of markets still ahead for that film. So let's go through some of the movies in the top 10, different marks and different charts for a lot of them. And we will start, of course, with Barbie, which continues to rewrite the record books. And let's look this week, first of all, at Warner Brothers. The studio record books are being rewritten. First of all, these are the highest grossing films of all time domestically for Warner Brothers, and you'll see that through the weekend, Barbie fell just short, but as we're sitting here talking now, Barbie has likely passed The Dark Knight to become the highest grossing film in the history of Warner Brothers, the studio. The Dark Knight will be surrendering that spot that it's held for about 15 years to Barbie. The Dark Knight Rises is at number 3, Wonder Woman is at number 4, and Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 is at number 5. Now, when you adjust these figures for inflation over time, then the chart does change, but Barbie is still there. Adjusted for inflation, Barbie is now the 5th highest grossing film of all time at Warner Brothers. It will soon pass Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, which made $550.7 million adjusted. Then The Dark Knight Rises is actually still there in third place at $596.6 million. 1989's Batman is in second place with an adjusted total of $619.7 million, and The Dark Knight is back on its perch at number 1 with $757.7 million adjusted for inflation. If Barbie keeps its trajectory going, it should be able to hit at least number 2, and then we'll see if it's able to keep going to $750+ million domestically. One chart, though, where Barbie has already hit number 1 is Warner Brothers' highest grossing films of all time worldwide. It has displaced Aquaman. Barbie's sitting at $1.18 billion. Aquaman now number 2 at $1.14 billion. The Dark Knight Rises is at number 3 at just over $1 billion, followed by Joker. Remember, that was a $1 billion movie back in 2019. It's at number 4. And then Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's/Philosopher's Stone, depending on where you live, its gross is also at just over $1 billion. So Barbie today will become the highest grossing film of all time in Warner Brothers history domestically, already the highest grossing film of all time in Warner Brothers history worldwide. And then when we look at Greta Gerwig, she now has the highest grossing film ever directed or co-directed by a woman domestically, $526.4 million. That displaces Frozen 2, which was co-directed by Jennifer Lee. It's now in second place. Captain Marvel is in third. Wonder Woman is in fourth place. And Frozen is in fifth place. Barbie hasn't quite gotten to the top of the list worldwide, though. It's now at number 3 all-time as far as films directed or co-directed by women. It has passed the gross of Captain Marvel, co-directed by Anna Boden. And it is very close, about $100 million away from passing the worldwide gross of the original Frozen film, and it's about $170 million away from passing Frozen 2 to become the highest grossing film ever directed or co-directed by a woman worldwide in history, and we will continue to track it and see if it gets there. Barbie does remain on track to be the highest grossing domestic film of the year. This is its day-to-day box office in comparison with the Super Mario Brothers movie, which is currently the #1 2023 domestic film, as well as the #1 film worldwide. Through 24 days, the Super Mario Brothers movie had grossed $458.9 million. Barbie is currently about $70 million ahead of that pace, so unless it really flattens out over the next couple weeks, which it does not really show any signs of doing, then it should become the highest grossing film of the year domestically. And when we look at the film versus other top grossers of the decade, you can see it is still easily outpacing Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. Now, Top Gun Maverick, which is that green line, that's one to watch because it had great longevity, and we'll see how that matches against what Barbie's doing. And then you see that blue line. That is Avatar: The Way of Water. There was a huge gap between The Way of Water and Barbie, and now look at how close those lines are, and this will be something to watch as far as which film had the better legs, which movie is doing the best over weeks 4 and 5 and 6 of its release, because that will determine where Barbie falls as far as the highest grossing films of the decade and even maybe the highest grossing films of all time domestically. I want to make sure though that we devote some time to Oppenheimer because it is quietly having a very impressive box office run of its own. This is a chart that we looked at first last week, the highest grossing films to never hit #1 at the box office, and again, it is not quite #1 on this chart through the weekend, but as we sit here and talk, it has probably bypassed Sing domestically to become the highest grossing film ever to never hit #1 at the box office, presuming that it does not hit #1 in one of these other weekends, but there's a Barbie blockade on that #1 spot, so I don't think that it's going to. Right now, Sing has the #1 spot at $270.3 million. Oppenheimer's at $264.2 million, but it will soon have that top spot. Then My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Alvin and the Chipmunks, The Squeakquel, and Alvin and the Chipmunks, they're at those 3, 4, and 5 spots. So some ascendance there for Oppenheimer. And it is also working up another chart, which is the highest grossing biopics or biographical movies of all time. Now, I defined this by movies that were specifically centered around a person. I'm not talking about historical dramas, things like Dunkirk, which is another Christopher Nolan movie, certainly based on real events, but we're talking about movies that were centered on a specific person. And when we look at the highest grossing biopics domestically, I have The Revenant at #5. A lot of people would say like, well, that's not a real biopic because it's mostly fictionalized. Well, most of them are. It is based on a real person and real events that happened. So The Revenant is there at #5. If The Revenant wasn't there, it would be Lincoln. Bohemian Rhapsody is at #4 domestically. At #3 domestically, The Blind Side, which if you did not read the real life story around The Blind Side and Michael Orr and the family that quote unquote adopted him, but turned out maybe they didn't adopt him, go read that story because it is really quite something and puts that movie in a whole different context. In second place is Oppenheimer at $264.2 million, and it is now chasing American Sniper, which holds the domestic record for the highest grossing biopic of all time. We'll see if it's able to get there. Looking at the highest grossing biopics worldwide of all time, in fifth place is The Greatest Showman, again, highly fictionalized, but based on the life of P.T. Barnum at $430.5 million. The Revenant is at #4 worldwide at $532.9 million. Then American Sniper in third place at $547.3 million. Shockingly, this film was more popular in the United States than it was around the world. Oppenheimer is the second highest grossing biopic of all time worldwide at $648.1 million, and it is looking up at Bohemian Rhapsody. It was a huge hit worldwide, $882.2 million gross for Bohemian Rhapsody. That would be an achievement for Oppenheimer, although given its performance and the fact that it still has some markets that it has yet to play in, I've seen some people optimistically projecting that Oppenheimer could get up to $900 million worldwide. That's still a long way to go. I don't know if that is probable, but it's certainly possible. And if it is able to do that, then it would displace Bohemian Rhapsody as the highest grossing biopic of all time around the world. We've got so much more to get to, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsors for this week's show. This episode is brought to you by Babbel, and the best way to learn a language is through immersion, living where that language is spoken natively and using it every day. But that's not possible for everybody. So what's the second best way? Well, that would be Babbel, because with Babbel, you can start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks. Now, you could pay hundreds of dollars for a private tutor or try other language apps that are pretty much just games, or you can give Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons a shot, which are designed by over 150 language experts. And these lessons aren't meant to make you sound like a student memorizing grammar from a textbook. Babbel's lessons are designed to allow you to sound like a native speaker of that language regardless of your skill level. I've been traveling before in countries where I don't know the language, and it's embarrassing to not know how to do basic things like ask for directions. But with Babbel, you can learn everything you need in Italian, Spanish, German, French, Portuguese, and so many more. Babbel has a wide range of learning experiences, from casual to intense, which means that there's always a way to fit in a Babbel study session, from self-study app lessons to podcasts to live classes. Here's a special limited time deal for people watching and listening to the show. To get you started right now, get 55% off of your Babbel subscription, but only for people that watch the show at babbel.com/Dan. Get 55% off at babbel.com/Dan. That's spelled BABBEL.com/Dan. Rules and restrictions may apply. This show is brought to you by AG1, a daily nutritional supplement that supports whole body health. People are going back to school, the summer is winding down, but for a lot of folks, that means you are busier than ever, and you don't have time for that leisurely summer breakfast that you've been enjoying for the last few months. That also means it's the perfect time for AG1. I drink it every morning, and it makes me feel like I'm covering my nutritional bases. Whether you're running out to class or you're traveling like I do a lot, the channel's always got me busy. Whatever your excuse is, it's important to keep things on track when it comes to things like your immune system, your gut health, and so much more. I've struggled in the past with keeping to a routine, but drinking AG1 is fast and as simple as making a breakfast drink in the morning. It's just 1 scoop of powder mixed with water once a day, and that's it. Each scoop is packed with 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients. And I also have some great single serving AG1 travel packs, so I never have to miss a day, even when I'm on the go. With AG1, it's really that simple. If you want to take ownership of your health, try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs right now with your first purchase. Just go to drinkag1.com/Dan. That's drinkag1.com/Dan to check it out. I mentioned Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem earlier. It's doing great as far as merchandising, and it is climbing up the charts as far as the Turtles franchise. It's now the 5th highest grossing film of all time domestically. It has passed the grosses of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 and 2007's TMNT. It will soon bypass Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, The Secret of the Ooze, and then 2016's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows, and then we'll see how it does. Is it able to bypass 1990's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie? I don't know. We'll have to see how the legs are. I don't think it's going to touch 2014, but it could get as high as number 2, guaranteed to get up to number 3 on this list. When you look at the franchise adjusted for inflation, it is still the lowest grossing film for now, although depending on how it does in the next week, it could be as high as number 4 by next week, bypassing Out of the Shadows, Ninja Turtles 3, and TMNT, and then we'll have to see where it goes from there. I think it's likely to end up at number 4 on this chart. And then looking at the worldwide gross for this franchise, again, it is at number 5. It will soon bypass TMNT, but then it has a pretty big hill to climb if it wants to touch 1990's Ninja Turtles movie, which was at $200 million. 2014 is really out of reach at this point, but again, this was a pretty well-received film. It's driving a lot of merchandising sales. The budget was responsible, so we'll see just how this does over the long run. Meg 2 is a movie that opened well last weekend, especially given how some sequels have fared this summer, but it's not necessarily faring that well when you look at it compared to its predecessor, which was The Meg, which came out 5 years ago. This is the Meg's run versus Meg 2. The Meg is in blue there, Meg 2 is in orange, and you can see that a pretty big gap has opened up. At this point in its release, The Meg had about $30 million more at the box office than Meg 2 currently has. So we're seeing a pretty big fall off domestically between these two films. But again, the budget wasn't outrageous on this movie, and it's doing particularly well, of course, in China and in other markets. So it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that we could see another Meg movie based on what we've seen so far, but we are definitely seeing a diminishing return for it here domestically, and likely even still around the world. Finally, in the top 10, let's look at Mission Impossible, which has finally broken that $500 million mark around the world. It's now the 5th highest grossing film in the franchise. It will soon bypass the theatrical gross for Mission Impossible 2 worldwide, but that looks to be about where it's going to end up at number 4, well behind Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, as well as Ghost Protocol and Fallout. This is another movie like Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny that as we get closer to the end of its run, I'm going to update my profitability outlook. It is not going to turn a profit because it was a hugely expensive movie. And, of all the movies this summer that came out and didn't do well, even though I liked a lot of the movies that didn't do well, this is the one I actually feel bad for because I thought it was a really good movie. I enjoyed this movie a lot, but it just didn't connect with audiences, either because of Barbenheimer and the fact that everybody's attention was shifted just a week after it came out, or something with the marketing, or the movie itself, just for the average audience that just didn't want to go out and see it. A lot of times when a movie doesn't do well, like The Flash or Indiana Jones, I get it. This is one that's a little bit tougher for me to understand, but this is a really tough marketplace this summer with a lot of movies like Barbie and Oppenheimer and even Sound of Freedom that were eating up chunks of the audience that many people did not anticipate. Let's take a look at some weekend charts for the 11th through the 13th, and we'll start with the per theater averages. At number 1 is a documentary that I mentioned on last week's show called The Eternal Memory, about one man and his wife's struggle with Alzheimer's over a series of years. It was playing in just one theater, but brought in $12,000 in that one theater. In second place is Winter Kills, which is a film from 1979. It is a presidential assassination thriller starring Jeff Bridges, Anthony Perkins, John Huston, and many, many more. It was playing at Film Forum in New York. It'll actually be playing in the New Beverly, Quentin Tarantino's theater in Los Angeles, in a couple of weeks. This is a re-release that Tarantino was very vocal about. He helped to publicize it. So this isn't one of the 4K restorations necessarily, but this is just an old-fashioned re-release on 35mm for those film buffs out there. Barbie comes in bringing in $8,098 per theater in each of its 4,178 theaters. Jailer comes in fourth at $5,689 in 450 theaters. And Oppenheimer in fifth place, still bringing in a lot of money, just over $5,000 in 3,761 theaters. Looking at movies in limited release, which I define as 1,000 theaters or fewer, Jailer was at number 1. It played in 450 theaters for a total of $2.5 million. Gadar 2 played in 350 theaters and brought in $1.1 million, another film out of India. In third place is Jules, a film starring Ben Kingsley about a man who befriends an alien who crash lands in his backyard. It played in 780 theaters and brought in $838,000. Theater Camp, which I mentioned earlier in the show, does not look to be headed toward a wide release. It has started to shed theaters. It's now in 410 theaters. It made $274,000 this past weekend. I really wish, and again, you never know how these things are going to happen. I wish that Searchlight, who's handling the distribution of the movie, had waited to put that movie out in the fall, when there was a lot more time for it to sit and gain attention and get people to go see it, because it just got swallowed up into this behemoth of a last part of the summer, and I think it just got lost in the shuffle. And that is a shame. I think it's a really, really good movie. Yes, people can watch it at home, but it's an audience movie. It's one of those movies, a comedy that I think people have fun watching together. Just not in the cards, unfortunately. And in fifth place is Passages, which went up to 41 theaters in its second week of release for a total of $85,000. Of course, many of these movies that you can find in limited release, along with independent films over the years, can be found at the different independent theaters that are scattered around the country. It's a feature that I skipped last week because we had a very full show, but I wanted to return to it this week. And this week I'm featuring a theater in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. It's called the Sun Cinema. It's just 2 miles down 16th Street Northwest from the White House. In 2015, co-founders Dave Cabrera and Ryan Mitchell raised $16,000 on Kickstarter to help get this theater off the ground. It was opened in 2016. It's a small 40-seat theater featuring improvised seats, just whatever seats they could find, and curated selections that veer far away from mainstream first-run showings, and even a lot of independent theaters that show older titles. This month, for example, the theater is featuring films from Bolivian filmmaker Jorge Sanjines and Hungarian director Miklos Jankso. In addition to the screening room, the Sun Cinema also has a bar to hang out and dissect what you just saw. And when you look at all of the theaters that I've spotlighted so far here on the show, this one to me, and I haven't been there, but just from what I've gathered and what I've seen, the pictures, etc., seems to have the most indie sensibility in the sense of like, it is very no frills. Like I said, the seats look like, like some of them are like ballpark seats. Some of them are just regular old chairs. Some of them are like wingback chairs. It's whatever they could find. It's a very, very small venue, and it really looks to be programmed for the love of movies. Literally to say like, hey, let's try this. Let's throw this movie out there. Well, this might be a terrible movie, but let's see how people react to it. It really is the sort of thing of like, we're operating this thing at a scale where we can show whatever the hell we want, and we're just going to see if people show up and if they like it. And if 2 people show up and dig it, then we've done our job. That is indie cinema at its heart. And this really does seem to be a theater that operates for the love of cinema. If you want to find out more about Sun Cinema, you can find their latest schedule at sunscinema.com. They also have a Patreon page at patreon.com/sunscinema. And if you end up heading there or supporting them in any way, of course, as always, be sure to tell them that Dan sent you. Before we look at the week ahead, let's take a look at 2023 thus far. And the top grossing movie of the year for now is the Super Mario Brothers movie, but Barbie seems like it is on an imminent collision course to take that number 1 spot. It is now less than $50 million behind the gross of Super Mario Brothers with no end in sight. So we could very well be seeing a changing of the guard as early as next week. At number 1. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse remains at number 3. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is at 4. And The Little Mermaid is at number 5. Sound of Freedom moves up to number 9 on the chart for the year. And Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny now moves to the Doomsday spot at number 10. This is the chart for 2023 worldwide, and you can see that Barbie is now less than $200 million away from eclipsing the Super Mario Brothers movie here as well. Let's see if it can keep up its momentum around the world. The top 5 remains the same. Oppenheimer moves up to number 7. It is now close to $650 million worldwide. The Wandering Earth bumped down 1 spot to number 8. The Little Mermaid dropped down 1 spot to number 9. And then Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 finally jumps onto this list. It's the 10th highest grossing movie of the year so far at the worldwide box office. It drops out the previous 10th place film, China's Lost in the Stars. Before we wrap things up, as always, I like to take a look at a weekend in box office history, and we are going back to the 32nd weekend of the year, August 7th through the 9th, 1987, which saw the debut of one of my favorite 80s movies. It's not The Living Daylights, which I think has gotten a bit of a reevaluation over time. That would be the first Timothy Dalton James Bond film. It was both his first and also penultimate James Bond movie. In its second week of release, The Living Daylights topped the box office at $7.7 million for a running total of $24.7 million to that point. In second place was the debut of a new comedy called Stakeout, starring Richard Dreyfuss and Emilio Estevez. It made $5.1 million in its opening weekend on its way to a $65.6 million domestic total. In third place is the movie I talked about, Masters of the Universe, starring Dolph Lundgren and Frank Langella. It is not a good movie. in any way, shape, or form. It does have one of the most committed villain performances of all time with Frank Langella as Skeletor, but it is like a DNA movie for me as far as growing up as a kid. I acknowledge that it's bad. I still enjoy watching it. It opened to $4.8 million. It was a financial disaster for the studio, a $17.3 million total overall domestically for that film. La Bamba was a big hit in the summer of 1987. In its third week, it dropped just 13.6% for a $4.4 million total. It made $54 million domestically before its run ended. And then in fifth place, The Lost Boys, which made $4 million in its second weekend for a $12.7 million total to that point. Of course, we could just leave that movie sitting there, but you know what we like to do? We like to put it in context and see what those numbers look like in today's dollars by hitting that inflation button. And when we hit that inflation button, we see that The Living Daylights would have been number one with $20.7 million in its second week, on its way to a $137.7 million domestic total, which would be pretty low when you think about where James Bond movies usually end domestically nowadays. It kind of goes to show you why Dalton maybe didn't have a long run in that role. Stakeout adjusted opened to $13.9 million, a final total of $176.7 million adjusted for inflation. Masters of the Universe with $13.1 million and an adjusted final total of $46.6 million. La Bamba, again, a very popular film, the biopic, another biopic actually in the top five, with $12 million in week three and a final domestic total adjusted of $145.8 million. And then The Lost Boys, the fact that it's such a popular film, I think people maybe would have assumed that it was more popular at the time. $10.7 million adjusted in week two, a final domestic total of $86.7 million, which is good, but not a blockbuster. And it just goes to show you that not all of the movies that make the most money at the box office have the biggest box office legacies, because I would say that arguably The Lost Boys is probably the movie out of those five that people reference and talk about the most, and yet it was one of the lowest grossing of those five films. Let's take a look now at the week ahead, and something we've been doing for the past several weeks now is a feature I call Rotten Tomatoes Decoded, where I look at movie reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. In case you don't know how it works, that tomato meter score that you see is not indicative of quality. It just tells you how many critics said that a movie was good versus how many said that it was bad. It's a binary metric of yes, no, fresh, rotten, but it doesn't indicate quality, and that can kind of skew sometimes what the critical consensus of a movie really is. So let's look at some new and upcoming releases. First of all, by Tomato Meter, that binary rating system. And you see that Meg 2, The Trench is down there at the bottom with 28%. Gal Gadot's new movie, Heart of Stone on Netflix, is at 31%. The Last Voyage of the Demeter, and this is important, look at these two totals. The Last Voyage of Demeter right now is at 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, which means half the critics said they liked it and half the critics said they didn't like it. Gran Turismo is at 60%, which is technically fresh now on Rotten Tomatoes. Red, White, and Royal Blue is a new addition here. It's on Amazon Prime right now. It has an 81% fresh. And then we have some holdover movies, except for that number one movie there. You see Bottoms, which is at 97%. It's a small number of reviews right now. Bottoms is a film that has played a few different film festivals. It is the second film from writer-director Emma Seligman, who had a movie called Shiva Baby that came out a couple of years ago. It was a big underground hit. This is her follow-up to that film. She co-wrote the movie with the star of the film, Rachel Sennett, who also was the star of Shiva Baby. She was in Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. She's actually one of my favorite new actors that's working today. I think that she's fantastic. And I'm looking forward to this film. It's about a couple of high school girls who start a fight club, nominally for self-defense, but mainly so they can pick up those same high school girls. It's reportedly gotten some great early reactions. It doesn't come out until next week, but it should be on people's radar, especially if the reactions from critics stay this positive. Right now, it's leading the movies that I'm featuring here on this chart, but let's look now at the average rating. What the average rating is a 1 through 10 score that critics give the movies, and it's not just whether they liked a movie, but it's how much they liked it, and it can really be illuminating when you're trying to figure out what critics actually think about films. For example, let's look at Gran Turismo and The Last Voyage of the Demeter. Remember I said Gran Turismo is at a 60% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes right now, and The Last Voyage of the Demeter is at a 50% rotten. And yet when you look at them, by critics' average rating, Gran Turismo actually has a lower critics rating than The Last Voyage of the Demeter, although they're just about even. Gran Turismo has a 5.6, Last Voyage of the Demeter has a 5.7. What does this mean? That means that critics felt almost identically about these two films. Gran Turismo has a 60% fresh because just enough critics went, okay, I'll say that it's good. And Last Voyage of the Demeter has a 50% rotten because just enough critics went, you know what, I didn't like it so much. But really, they like these two movies almost exactly the same. So that 10% disparity on the tomato meter, and even the fact that one of them is fresh and one of them is rotten, is very misleading. That's why I do this, to sort of illuminate what those differences can be when you're just looking at the tomato meter versus the average score. And as has been the case for the past several weeks, even though Oppenheimer has a lower tomato meter score than Bottoms, as well as movies like Talk to Me and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, it still has the highest critics average score of any movie that I'm featuring on the chart. It has an 8.6, so if you're looking in this group as far as which movies critics on average like the most, that would be Oppenheimer, although Bottoms currently right now has an 8.4 critics average rating. That is higher than Barbie and really every other movie except for Oppenheimer. And as more reviews come in, it will be interesting to see if the critical opinion stays this high on Bottoms, because then that means that it could be a word of mouth hit, or at least one of these underground hits that could start generating some real buzz. But before we get to Bottoms and the other movies that are coming out next week, we have to look at the movies that are coming out this week, and here is a small sampling of what you can see in theaters. First of all, opening tomorrow on Wednesday is a re-release and a remaster in 4K of Park Chan-wook's original Oldboy. Oldboy is celebrating its 20th anniversary because even though it didn't come out in the United States until 2005, it was originally released in South Korea in 2003. Neon acquired the distribution rights, and it's putting really its heft behind a 4K re-release of the film to celebrate its 20th anniversary. If you haven't seen Oldboy, it is a great film. It is also a supremely messed up film. It was remade by Spike Lee. I don't think that movie really held a candle to the original film. So if you want to see Oldboy, prepare yourself. But it is a really good movie, and you'll be able to see that 4K restoration in theaters starting tomorrow. Opening in wide release this weekend is DC's Blue Beetle. There are currently no reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. I can tell you there are perhaps critic screenings in LA and New York. There are not critic screenings planned for anywhere else regionally, so I will be going to see it on Thursday for its first previews, and then I'll probably have a review up of the film on Friday morning. I'm anxious to see it. There's been, well, it seems like there's positive early buzz about every movie, so at this point I just kind of wait and see what happens. But you know, it's not negative buzz at this point. I don't know. Also opening this weekend is Strays, which I'll be seeing on Wednesday night. I'll have my review up for the film on Thursday morning. And then in less wide release around the country, we have Back on the Strip, which stars Wesley Snipes, J.B. Smoove, Tiffany Haddish, Kevin Hart, Faison Love, amongst others. It's about the reunion of a group of male strippers. It's not listed in wide release, but I think it's going to be in a lot of theaters. And then in true limited release, there are several movies, including The Adult, starring Michael Cera as a guy who returns home and reunites with childhood friends. There's also a South Korean film about the moon, about an astronaut stranded in space. Landscape with an Invisible Hand. This sounds like an interesting movie. It's from Corey Finley. I've enjoyed his previous two films, Thoroughbreds and Bad Education. It's about two teens who broadcast their relationship to amuse an occupying group of alien invaders. This seems like the kind of thing that I would enjoy. Also in limited release is a movie called Birth Rebirth, which is an indie horror film about the perils of reanimating the dead. That movie played at Sundance. I was not able to see that, but I was able to see another movie that's opening called Mutt, and I really liked this movie. It's about a trans man attempting to reconnect with loved ones as he transitions into a new life. When we talk about movies being an empathy machine or an empathy factory, as Roger Ebert and others have said very famously, this is the kind of movie that they're talking about, and I really like this movie. It's a very small movie, but I found it to be a very effective movie. And then finally, Metallica, the M72 World Tour. 2 different nights, 2 different live streams from Dallas, Texas. So basically, like we've seen with other groups, it is the live stream of a Metallica concert, one on Friday night, one on Sunday night. The trick here is that the shows are going to be completely different. So Metallica is going to play one set of songs on Friday night, and one set of songs on Sunday night. And it's being broadcast live from Dallas on the 50-yard line at the football stadium there. So it's a pretty big event. If you're a Metallica fan, you've got not one but 2 nights of entertainment coming up to see the live stream of that concert in theaters. And that wraps it up for this week. Be sure to check out the description below for more about our sponsors, as well as those links that I mentioned at the top of the show. And stay tuned right here on the channel, because as I mentioned, I've got reviews of Strays and Blue Beetle coming up this week. I also do actually have, the show is almost completely prepped, and I'm planning to put it out tomorrow morning, another edition of Streaming Charts with Dan. We actually have a lot of data to get through, like almost 2 months of charts where we talk about the big breakout hits on Netflix, Suits, the big breakout hit of the summer, as well as looking at Secret Invasion and how it's done so far in the ratings, or at least as far back as we can track the ratings. So there's some interesting numbers to look at. If you didn't get your full dose of numbers today, I don't know how you could still want any more, but if you do, be sure to stay tuned tomorrow for Streaming Charts. Plus, you never know what's going to pop up here on the channel. If there's breaking strike news, if they're able to come to some sort of a deal with the writers, then of course I will update you on that and so much more. Thank you so much for spending part of your day here with me. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.